The cartographers' conclave on Station Meridian Voss had been charting the expansion front for 340 years. Its admission rate was 4%, the lowest of any officer program in the coalition, because a bad coordinate did not just fail a test, it killed the ships that trusted it. A jump lane drawn 1 decimal wrong could put a transport into a gravity well that had not existed on any chart when the transport left port. Every stable lane in the outer arm had been drawn by someone who had sat in these rooms first, under this same ceiling, learning the same calibration models. The conclave measured its own history the way it measured everything else, in verified numbers. 340 years of continuous operation, 61 graduating classes, a library of 11,000 confirmed coordinates, each one cross-checked by no fewer than 3 independent observation posts before it was allowed onto a navigational chart. The conclave did not deal in probability. It dealt in confirmation. Every cadet who passed through the program learned the same founding case study in their first week. The Aether collapse, 2 centuries prior, when a single unverified coordinate had sent an 11-ship convoy into a gravitational shear that no chart had warned them about. The conclave had been founded in part out of that failure. Its entire culture, the triple checksums, the independent observatories, the refusal to accept a single source as proof of anything, traced back to that one collapsed convoy. New cadets were shown the wreckage survey in their orientation module before they were shown anything else. In 3 centuries, 19 humans had been admitted to the program. 6 had graduated. Human sensory calibration, the admissions literature noted with a kind of institutional politeness, was considered adequate but not exceptional for long-range boundary work. A polite way of saying that human eyes and instruments alike tended to miss the faint gravitational lensing that marked the true edge of a stable region, the kind of signal that took specialized training to read reliably. The current class had won. Rin Ape was 26 years old, out of the Frontier Survey Corps, and had applied to the conclave with a service record that Chartmaster Ilna Vosk read twice. The first read produced a coordinate that did not match any accepted model of the expansion front, a data point so far outside the calibration tolerances that Vosk's initial assumption was clerical error, a transposed digit, a corrupted file. The verification request went out to 3 separate observatories along the frontier, none of which knew about the others' involvement. All 3 came back confirmed. The coordinate was real. The timestamp was real. The instrument logs showed no signs of tampering, no signs of malfunction, nothing that could explain away the number except that the number was, according to every model the conclave had ever built, impossible. Vosk had run the verification a 4th time herself, alone, after the observatories reported back, because 30 years of running the admissions board had taught her that some numbers needed to be wrong through a process of elimination, rather than accepted on the first pass. The 4th run matched the first 3. Rin had not mentioned any of this in her interview. She had answered questions about jump plane theory and boundary calibration with the same even tone she used for everything else. And when Vosk had asked, almost as an afterthought, whether her service record contained anything unusual, Rin had said that she'd flown some long routes. She arrived at the station on a supply transport 3 days before orientation, found her assigned quarters, and unpacked a courier's field kit that still smelled faintly of drift ice. The compressed, mineral smell of long-haul cold storage that never quite washed out of canvas. She did not introduce herself to her cohort beyond what was required. She got to work on the reading list a full week before classes began, and by the 3rd week, she had a reputation among her cohort not for being remarkable, but for being unremarkable in a way that made a few of them wonder what they were missing. The challenge came during a 3rd-year seminar on boundary calibration theory, 6 weeks into the term, in front of the full cohort of 11 cadets. The seminar had been discussing the limits of confirmed charting, how far out a coordinate could be trusted before the models simply ran out of data to check it against. Cadet Prius Kell, Draylen, 4th year, ranked 1st in stellar cartography for 3 consecutive terms, had a habit of steering seminar discussions toward wherever his own expertise looked best. This was not considered a flaw by his instructors. It was considered ambition, and ambition was rewarded at the conclave the same way confirmed coordinates were rewarded, with rank. What the cohort did not know, and what only came out afterward, was that Kell had spent 2 evenings that week quietly pulling public shipping manifests for the Frontier Survey Corps, trying to reconstruct which routes Rin might have flown before her admission. He found nothing conclusive. The core manifests were sparse on courier assignments. But he found enough gaps in the record to convince himself that there was a story worth drawing out of her in front of an audience. He did not consider this unfair. He considered it due diligence, the same kind of verification the conclave asked of every coordinate. He introduced the question the way that certain cadets introduce questions, which is to say with the timing and tone of someone who has prepared it, who has been waiting through several minutes of unrelated discussion for precisely the right gap to open up, so that the question can arrive as though it were spontaneous. So, Kel said, turning slightly in his seat, not quite looking at Rin, but positioned so the whole room could see that he was addressing her. "What's the oldest point you've ever put on a chart, Ape?" Several cadets smiled. It was a specific category of smile, the kind that happens in rooms where an informal hierarchy is being quietly reconfirmed rather than challenged. Nobody in the room believed the human courier pilot was about to say anything that would trouble the seminar's usual order. Kel's question was not cruel. It was the natural behavior of someone who had never had his own framework meaningfully tested, and who did not expect this to be the day it started. Chartmaster Vosk, seated at the head of the table, said nothing. She had pulled Rin's telemetry files in the second week of the term. She had read the observatory confirmations 3 times each. She had run her own 4th verification alone, at night, in an empty office, and had told no one. She had been waiting since then for a discussion topic that would let the question arrive on its own, without her having to manufacture the moment herself. "That's a reasonable question," Rin said, in the tone of someone who genuinely found it reasonable, without a trace of the awareness that the room expected. No defensiveness, no irony, no sense that she understood herself to be at the center of anything. "Do you want the accepted model answer, or the actual one?" Kel's smile widened by a fraction, the expression of someone who has just been handed a better version of the setup than he'd planned for. "The actual one." Rin gave him a coordinate, a string of numbers that meant nothing to most of the cohort on first hearing, and a date that sat, quietly and without any drama in her voice, more than 1,000,000 years before anything on the conclave's official charts. The room went quiet the way a held breath goes quiet. Nobody moved to fill the silence. Kel's smile stayed on his face for another 2 seconds, the way an expression sometimes outlasts the reason for it. Vosk stood and opened the console at the front of the room. "Since the second week," she said, "I've had this pulled up and ready. I was waiting for the right question to arrive." The feed she put on the main display was not a simulation. Simulations had a particular polish to them, a smoothed, rendered quality that every cadet in the room could recognize within half a second of looking at it. This was documentary telemetry, raw, unedited, time-stamped by instruments that recorded in absolute date time regardless of who was watching. The first data point showed Rin's courier ship, 3 years prior, registering a stable region well beyond the known expansion front, a region the conclave's own charts marked, to that day, as unresolved. The telemetry showed the moment of registration itself, a routine navigational ping, logged without any indication that Rin's instruments understood they were recording something the conclave would later spend a full seminar period trying to process. Nobody spoke. The second data point showed spectral analysis from an independent long-range observatory, dating that same region roughly 13,000,000 years before the conclave's own calibration epoch. Before, according to every accepted model of the expansion front's advance, that region should have existed as chartable space at all. Vosk let the analysis sit on the screen a moment longer than necessary, long enough for a few of the cadets to start working through the math themselves. The third data point was a cross-confirmation from a second observatory, run without knowledge of the first, arriving at a timestamp within a margin of error the conclave considered acceptable for confirmed coordinates. One of the cadets near the back of the room, a Vantari 3rd year named Asa who rarely spoke in seminar, said quietly, "That's not supposed to be possible," to no one, and nobody answered her. The fourth was a formal review board stamp, dated, signed, and marked, simply, unresolved, pending model revision. Vosk noted almost as an aside that the review board's own internal notes on the stamp described the case as the most significant unresolved coordinate the board had processed in over 40 years, and that it had been sitting in a queue for further study since the year it was filed. By the time Vosk brought up the 5th data point, a third independent confirmation, requested specifically because the review board had refused to accept the first two alone. Kel was no longer smiling. He was watching the display with the expression of someone running a calculation that was clearly going to take longer than the seminar period to finish. His jaw had not moved. His eyes had not moved either, except to track the numbers scrolling past. Nobody in the cohort spoke through any of it. The silence held through the fourth data point, and through the fifth, and settled into something closer to stillness than quiet, the specific kind of stillness that happens when 11 people are simultaneously deciding not to be the first one to say anything. Vosk let the fifth data point sit on the screen for a full minute before she closed the feed. She did not summarize it. She did not explain what it meant for the conclave's models going forward. She simply closed the console, the way a person closes a door on a room they intend to come back to. The seminar ended without anyone assigning next week's reading, which was itself unusual enough that a few cadets exchanged glances on their way out. Kel was among the last to gather his materials. He stood when the room had mostly emptied, packed his data slate with the same efficiency he brought to everything, and stopped at the door on his way out. "The models are going to need revising," he said, not quite turning to look back at the room, a thought finishing itself out loud, addressed to no one in particular rather than an admission made directly to Rin. It was not an apology, and it was not meant to be one. It was a person recalibrating in real time, out loud, because the alternative was carrying the miscalibration silently, and he did not seem built for that. He paused another moment at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe. "I spent 2 evenings this week trying to find a hole in your service record," he said, still not turning around. "I didn't find one. I should have looked for a hole in the models instead." Then he left, and the door closed behind him without any further sound. Rin packed her field kit, the same one that still carried the faint mineral smell of drift ice, and said nothing in response to any of it. She had not spoken since giving the coordinate. She did not seem to feel she had anything left to add. Vosk waited until the room had emptied entirely before she spoke again. "Since week 2, she said, "I've been waiting for someone to ask you the right question. I could have brought the footage to a lecture myself. It wouldn't have landed the same way." Rin nodded once. "I wasn't trying to make it land any particular way." "I know," Vosk said. "That's why it did." There was a pause, brief and unremarkable, the kind that happens between two people who have said what they came to say. "The review board is going to want a formal debrief," Vosk added. "Not tonight, next week probably, take a few days first." "All right," Rin said. She picked up the field kit and walked out without anything further to say. Vosk sat back down at the console once the room was empty, and for a while she did not write anything. She pulled the 5 data points back up on the display, one at a time, and looked at each of them again in the quiet of the room, not because she doubted them, but because 30 years in the role had taught her that the moments worth remembering were the ones that happened right after everyone else had left. She closed the feed a second time. She opened the cohort's assessment log, found Rin Ake's name near the bottom of the list, and against it wrote 3 words, "Redrawing the Epic." She saved the file, and the station's ordinary evening rotation of lights dimmed 1 increment lower around her, on schedule, the way it did every night at this hour, whether or not anything on Meridian Voss's charts had just changed.